Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in a few minutes. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a conversation today about inpatient psychiatric hospitalization in Michigan, and we're going to talk about the importance of knowing your rights. Before we begin, I want to make this statement. The subject that we will be discussing this evening, what it's like to be admitted to a psychiatric unit or hospital and detained against one's will, may be triggering for those who may have experienced situations similar to the ones that we will be discussed today. The topic may not be suitable for children and adolescents under the age of 14. And if you or if someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, please call 988, the National Crisis Line, to be connected with a trained professional who can assist you. So over the past 4 years, a lot has been focusing on mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression, significantly increased during the pandemic, highlighting the importance of ensuring that individuals experiencing a psychiatric crisis have access to care. The conversation we're having today is important for anybody who might need to access emergency psychiatric treatment. The goal for this evening is to talk about some problems that have arisen for individuals who sought emergency psychiatric treatment, but who found themselves inappropriately detained in a psychiatric hospital or psychiatric unit. In February of this year, investigative reporter Heather Catallo aired a story on WXYZ about individuals who were being held against their will in a psychiatric hospital or a unit. This story highlighted the fact that the legal process that is supposed to be followed when an individual is hospitalized on a voluntary, meaning they consent, or involuntary basis, meaning that they aren't consenting to treatment, was not adhered to, creating situations for individuals that were traumatizing and violated their civil rights. These individuals report that they were locked up against their will and held in psychiatric hospitals or units for extended periods of time without the ability to exercise their rights to due process. Hi again, everybody. My name is Mary Ann Huff. I am the president and CEO of the Mental Health Association in Michigan. Founded in 1936, MHAM, as we are known, is the state of Michigan's oldest non-governmental advocacy organization dedicated to advocating for at the state and local level on behalf of individuals with mental health conditions and substance use disorders. We work by influencing mental health public policy and by advocating for positive change to mental health and substance use disorder policy in our state. As a representative of the Mental Health Association in Michigan, I feel an obligation to point out that this story is not intended to dissuade individuals who are in a psychiatric emergency from seeking an evaluation at the local emergency room. There are times when it is vital for an individual to seek treatment when symptoms of a mental health condition are not well controlled. We want to encourage you or anyone who is feeling overwhelmed by a mental health condition to seek help. Additional resources are provided throughout this discussion. At the same time, there are times when determining whether an individual is a person requiring treatment under Michigan law may not be appropriately applied. This is why MHAM, WXYZ-TV, and Disability Rights Michigan are collaborating together along with Bri Jackson to create this webinar. Tonight, you will hear from an individual who was detained in a psychiatric unit and was alleged to have a diagnosis that she has never been diagnosed with. Bri Jackson will share her story. You will hear from Heather Catallo, the investigative reporter from WXYZ-TV, who has been seeking answers as to why or how individuals might find themselves in a psychiatric hospital when it may not be necessary. You will hear from Simon Zagata, attorney with Disability Rights Michigan, the designated protection and advocacy in the state of Michigan. Simon will share information with you and about the involuntary hospitalization process, and he will also talk about your rights. In the state of Michigan, there's a set of laws called the Michigan Mental Health Code, which is Act 258 of 1974 is amended, and this set of laws governs the way that those who need emergency psychiatric treatment, such as inpatient care, should be treated. The process is outlined in Chapter 4 of what we call the Code. The process for being admitted to a psychiatric hospital can be voluntary, meaning that the person believes that they need to be treated in a hospital. Admission can also be done on an involuntary basis. Involuntary treatment means that an individual who is exhibiting signs and symptoms of a mental health condition that is not well controlled, but who may not recognize the need for treatment, may be admitted to a psychiatric hospital unit without his or their consent. Although a mental health condition affects the way one thinks or feels or behaves, the process for determining inpatient care is a legal one. In the law, there is a process that must be followed to minimize the violation of an individual's civil rights. We're going to talk about voluntary and involuntary admissions, and the goal here is to educate the community and those who experience mental health conditions about your rights if you find yourself needing emergency psychiatric treatment. I'm going to go ahead and invite or introduce our panelists today. So joining me today are Bri Jackson, who is a person who found herself at Pontiac General Hospital in 2022 after she sought a refill for her antidepressant at the emergency room of a local hospital. Heather Catallo, investigative reporter for WXYZ-TV in Detroit, and Simon Zagata, Director of Community and Institutional Rights at Disability Rights Michigan. Bri is proudly born and raised in Michigan. She earned a degree in public relations from Wayne State University and went on to earn a JD, Juris Doctor, at Cooley Law School. She is currently a finance professional. She is sharing her story with the hope that people who seek mental health care are treated with the respect, compassion, and dignity they deserve and need. Welcome, Bri. Heather Catallo is an award-winning investigative reporter whose work has changed laws, imprisoned criminals, prompted FBI investigations, and held public officials accountable. Heather has become nationally known for her investigations into Michigan's guardianship system. She is also the recipient of some of journalism's highest honors, including DuPont Columbia Award, regarded as the most prestigious prize in broadcast journalism. And Heather has also won 19 Emmy Awards. Welcome, Heather. And Simon Zagata joined Disability Rights Michigan as a staff attorney in 2019 and became the Director of Community and Institutional Rights Team in 2023. In 2020, Simon helped negotiate a settlement agreement with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services that fundamentally changed the mental health treatment process for individuals found not guilty by reason of insanity. Simon's team investigates allegations of abuse and neglect, rights violations, and disability-based discrimination inside prisons, nursing homes, and psychiatric hospitals. I'd like to welcome them all. Thank you for being here today. So the way that we're going to begin our conversation, which is actually more like a roundtable, is we're going to start by talking with Bri and asking her about her experience. And I know that Simon has some questions for you. So thanks, Bri. Thanks for being here today, for sharing your story with us and with the audience. It sounds like a traumatizing experience. And is it okay if we ask you some questions about that?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me.
I mean, Marion already said it, but thanks so much for joining us as well. And there's a guest appearance by the cat right off the bat. It wouldn't be a Zoom presentation without it. So, Bri, can you just tell us, I know Marianne mentioned that you went to the hospital at first or to the emergency department. Why did you go to that hospital in the first place, and what happened from there?
Well, I went to the hospital because I was directed to go there by my primary care physician, who I went to go see to get refills for my antidepressants. I had been laid off, so for the first time in my life, I was on Medicaid, and I hadn't been able to get my antidepressants while I was laid off, so I went there to go see him to get that refilled, and he directed me to go see a psychiatrist at the emergency room at Providence.
Were you able to see a psychiatrist there and get that medication refilled?
No, I wasn't.
So
I'm
what
sorry.
happened? No, hey, I've got 2 cats, 2 dogs, and a toddler. If something doesn't wander into my background, it'll be a miracle. Um, so, Bri, after you went there, they couldn't get you your medication. What happened from that point?
So I went to the emergency room and kind of told him I was there. I was there to see a psychiatrist for the purpose of getting my medication refilled. Since I hadn't had antidepressants and I lost my job, I was pretty sad. Like, I was definitely very depressed. So they admitted me to the emergency room. They took my vitals, did some tests, and then a resident or an attendee or someone came to talk to me for about 5 minutes. And basically after that, I could not leave. I went on to try to figure out what was going on. And the next day I found out that I had been diagnosed with something I never had before, which was psychosis.
So they didn't allow you to leave. Did they ever file a petition with the court to keep you there?
No, they just presented me with a court order that I went on to find out was never filed.
So I know that a big part of the story and Heather's investigation was about Pontiac General. How did you end up at Pontiac General? Did you agree to go there?
No, I did not. After 3 days at Ascension Providence, me like begging to see a psychiatrist or go home. I went there on a Friday, and on a Monday, they told me they were transporting me to Pontiac General, and I did not have a choice.
Once you were at Pontiac General, did you sign paperwork saying you agreed to the treatment, or?
I did, with a caveat. The reason I signed in to be treated was because if they told me that if I didn't sign in, they would file a petition with the court, and that could be up to 30 days for a hearing to be held, and the decision of that hearing could keep me there longer. So I signed it under duress, essentially.
So that didn't really feel like a choice to you.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
And Heather, during your investigation, is that something that you've seen more often than in Bri's case?
Yes, that's what really struck me. I actually was already working on this story when I was contacted about Bri's situation. So I knew about this problem, and her, what happened to her really lined up with the other things we were hearing. And people are telling us over and over and over again that when they sign in, yes, they're signing in voluntarily, but they really don't want to sign in once they're at that point, when they're getting to that psychiatric hospital. They've probably already been either in some intake or at an emergency room. But once they're there, they're basically, in their words, threatened. If you don't do this, you will go to court and stay much longer. And then they continue to ask for discharge, ask for an update, and I believe Bri did that. And they're just sort of at the whim of whenever someone else says they can get out, even though they're saying they're signing in voluntarily. But it, again, like Bri said, it doesn't feel voluntary.
It's a choice between giving up your rights in the hopes of being there a shorter amount of time, or attempting to enforce your rights, and they say, well, that's going to take longer. Is that a good way to put it?
I think so, from what everyone I've talked to. Go ahead, Bri. Sorry.
No, yeah, that's exactly how it felt. I was either at the whims of them deciding to keep me for less time, or their other whim, which was deciding to file a court order, which was even more indefinite than, the other option.
One thing too, I want to mention, you asked her about the diagnosis that she received when she was at the emergency room. So Bri was very open with me and shared all of her records with me, and we had extensive conversations over 2 years, and she had never received that diagnosis anywhere else. And it didn't really appear in other places in the records. So I've seen that in a couple of other situations where there's these terms used with these diagnoses, and they're very haphazard. One time, sometimes it'll say with psychosis, then for the same patient, it'll say without psychosis, or bipolar or not. There was another diagnosis in Bri's records that, again, she had never had before and has not had since. And so I think that is very concerning for people. This is not something that they feel they have. And why are they being diagnosed with these different things?
Yeah. Bri, for that diagnosis of psychosis, and in the story, I think it mentions that you were diagnosed with bipolar disorder as well while you were there. Do you even know who diagnosed you with those?
The psychosis, I for sure don't. The court order was clearly filled out and signed by 2 different people. So I'm unsure who diagnosed me with that. My only guess is the first person I saw, who I saw for about 5 minutes. The bipolar diagnosis, I actually didn't know about that until I was out and I obtained my medical records. So I also do not know who diagnosed me with that, for sure.
Also, too, the person that signed the certificate said she had psychosis. I went through her records with a fine-tooth comb, and Bri and I went over this over and over and over again. I know who that person is. I showed her a photo of the person. She says she never saw that person. And that person's name as a physician never appears in her records, not once. The only place it shows up is the signature on that petition. So that is concerning in the sense that there's a lot of other doctors that, she talked to, and social workers she talked to, and that's all documented in those electronic medical records with timestamps and everything. That signature of that person, and that person is employed by that hospital, it doesn't appear anywhere. That person's name's nowhere. So she maintains she never saw that doctor. So I guess to you two are experts, how concerning is that if somebody is signing off on these things and writing these diagnoses on there if they're not actually examining the patients?
I'll start because I'm off mute already, and then I'll go over to Marianne, but extremely concerning, especially because those certs are what is used to keep people in the hospital. That's kind of the first step when somebody presents. If the hospital believes that the person needs to be kept there involuntarily, there's a strict time limit and a need for that first certification. And so that is a significant deprivation of rights that's happening, and the certification is supposed to be performed by someone who is licensed to do so, so that it's only if somebody really needs it that that happens. So that's extremely concerning, to say the least.
I have a couple thoughts about it. I mean, you know, for the audience, I'm a licensed clinical social worker as well. What really concerns me is a couple things. One is informed consent. So if I'm in the hospital and I'm diagnosed with anything, whether it's a physical health condition or a mental health condition, I believe that I would have a right to know what's going on with me. And so to know that Bri was not even given a diagnosis of something like bipolar disorder, she had to go looking through her medical record to find it, is of great concern to me, because then the question becomes, well, what are you supposed to do if you really have that condition, which she does not, but the person really has something like that? Well, how does it affect their life? What kind of education are they getting about the condition? And going back to Heather and Simon's point, I can't imagine giving somebody any kind of a diagnosis without evaluating them. And an evaluation is not 10 minutes. It's an evaluation where you spend time with the person, you do a thorough mental status exam. And what I'm hearing is that that didn't happen either. And that's of great concern as well.
And you're
Sorry.
sorry, Heather. Mary Ann's points just made me think of two other things. And the first is medication and informed consent to medication. Because psychiatric medications can have really serious side effects, and it's a serious thing to decide whether to be on them or not. And people need to know exactly what their conditions are and how those medications will affect them before they make that decision. And the other thing is just that once that diagnosis is in your medical record, it can be very hard to remove, and that could affect your physical and mental health treatment.
One more thing too, that I want to add that's of concern to me, especially because of stigma. We're hearing about people predominantly being diagnosed with bipolar disorder or psychosis. I want to point out that by having a diagnosis alone does not mean that you are a candidate for inpatient psychiatric hospice. You know, the law is very clear about the certain criteria that have to be met before you become a person requiring treatment. I happen to know, personally speaking, a lot of people with significant mental health conditions, including bipolar 1 disorder and schizophrenia, who don't meet criteria for inpatient simply because they happen to have a certain label. And to Simon's point, similar in the medical side, when it comes to treatment and medications, if I have type 2 diabetes, I want to be treated for type 2 diabetes, but I want to know what medications I'm going to be given. In psychiatry, there are certain medications that are used to treat certain conditions. And as Simon said, there can be some really negative side effects from some of these medications. So part of the conversation that has troubled me about this entire issue is the lack of psychoeducation and informed consent about all these different pieces.
One of the things that I've heard repeatedly, especially since the story aired, on that medication issue is there are a lot of patients who have reached out to say they were put on really powerful and drugs that made them very, very groggy, and just really they had a hard time with it, and they'd never been put on those things before. Now, on one side, you might say, well, if somebody's being hospitalized, maybe they're needing a higher level of care, which is why they haven't been put on those things before. But if you're not really getting a proper diagnosis, or if something's going into your record indicating you have something that you don't, that's very alarming to these patients and these families, that they're being given these really powerful medications. So that is a repeat statement I'm hearing from families in the community.
that's very concerning, and I have heard from patients, you know, I just take the medication so that I'm compliant and can get out of here faster. Um, not informed consent. So, Bri, I did want to go back to you quickly for a couple more questions. Um, did anyone at Pontiac General ever tell you what you needed to do to get out of the hospital?
Uh, Not at all. It was a guessing game. So I just really tried to present my best self and kind of convince them that I was okay, at least okay enough to go home, which I was. I should have never been there. And on the medication front, for me, because I had a history of taking medication, they asked me what I was taking. I took the same thing at the same dose that I had been previously. So there was really no need for me to be there for observation reasons, anything like that. So I was there for about 10 days, and I just met with a psychiatrist every single day and was just waiting for them to tell me I could go home. And then magically one day I could go home. I didn't know how or what changed or why. It was just, they decided it was time, or they couldn't bill me anymore or something of that nature.
How long were you at Pontiac General before that happened?
I was there about 10 days. So between the two hospitals, it was about 12 or 13 days.
Well, Bree, thanks so much for sharing your story. I know it has helped a lot of people already, and it really highlights some of the issues we wanted to talk about here today.
I would
you.
just like to also thank Bri publicly. She was amazing to work with, and it took so much courage for her to talk to us the way she did. And I really, really commend her for doing that. And she did it because she wants to help other people. And I really am so grateful to you, Bri. Thank you for being this courageous and brave. It's really awesome.
And likewise, you feel so alone in there that no one's listening to you, that no one will ever listen. And just to be listened to really then and now it's very reassuring. So thank you all. Thank you, Simon, Mary, and all of you. Heather.
Well, Bri, I want to commend you. Here's one of the things, especially thinking about MHAM as an advocacy organization. Stigma against people with mental health conditions and substance use disorders is unfortunately alive and well. If somebody has a physical health condition, they're a lot more apt to talk about it. But when you have a mental health condition or a label, it can be very disabling for people because they get viewed through the lens of the label. So I really, again, want to commend you for being here today. So now I think what we want to chat about with Simon and Heather and Bri is, we've heard the worst case scenario. Bri's story has the elements of everything that could go wrong. But now I think what we want to talk about is not only what went wrong, but what should have happened in Bri's situation. So we want to kind of get a sense, Simon, can you talk about what should have happened with Bri?
Definitely. Obviously, I'm not a physician, so, well, maybe not obviously. I'm not a physician. So I'm speaking from a legal rights standpoint and from what Bri has said in her story. And I think it's important first to know that you can be a completely voluntary patient. Involuntary hospitalization is sort of the maximum level you meet a very specific legal definition. They are seeking a court order or have one for you to stay there. Getting a medication refill for depression is not that. And in fact, there is the kind of lowest status of restriction for inpatient hospitalization in Michigan is what's called an informal voluntary patient. And that is just someone who, like Bri, walks in to get treatment, says, yes, I'm here. I'm having some issues with my mental health. Here's what I need. Can you please treat me? And there does not need to be a written agreement. And the person who asked for treatment can leave at any time. And actually, the law says during normal business hours, and you have to tell the head of the unit that you're on, that you're leaving. To me, that is what should have happened in Bri's case. She goes in, she says she needs this treatment, she sees a psychiatrist. They should do an evaluation and make sure that she's in a good place and gets what she needs while she's there. But then once she's in that place where she's ready to go, and like Bri was saying, she has what she needs. She's got her medication. She's feeling a little better. She should be able to say to the unit head, I'm good. I'm going to terminate my treatment and walk right out. At worst, in Bri's case, the presentation of signing in voluntarily needs to be a truly voluntary choice. Hospitals are required to present that choice to people if they think it's appropriate, like if they think the person can meaningfully consent to voluntary treatment. But once they do that, the patient can still terminate their treatment by signing what's called an intent to terminate treatment form and presenting it, turning it in. And once that form's presented, the hospital has 3 days to decide, okay, we're either going to petition the court to keep this person involuntarily, or, yeah, we agree, they're ready to go, we think they're ready to go. And it doesn't have to take 3 days. They can decide that the moment that form's turned in, or they can decide it 48 hours later. But at the worst case, Bri should have had access to that form, been able to turn it in, and head out much earlier than she was able to, and not under threat of being there longer if she tried to enforce her rights.
And Heather, in your stories, isn't that also kind of a common theme that people are not being given notice of that, right?
I don't think people know about that form. We did mention that form in the story we did last Thursday. We do have a link to that form now on our website. And I don't know, but I'm wondering if the hospitals are not telling people about it. A regular thing that I'm also hearing from patients in various different hospitals is that, or who have been hospitalized, is that recipient rights is very hard to get a hold of in many of these places. So that's sort of a different issue, but it's related in the sense that I guess this might be a good question to pose to you right now, both of you. What should you do if you're a patient and you feel like you're ready to go and you signed in voluntarily? Ask for the form. Is there anything else that these patients can do because they're saying they're not having access to recipient rights and they're not being told that they can leave in this kind of situation?
Well, it's problematic if they don't have access to the recipient rights officer, because frankly, that is the whole role of the recipient rights officer, is to protect the person in the hospital's rights and to assist them with these types of activities. Simon, any other thoughts?
I mean, contact Disability Rights Michigan. We'll have our contact information at the end of this. But seriously, between Marianne and Heather and I, we've had calls from patients, and my team and I went to a psychiatric hospital a few weeks ago and helped someone get access to that form while we were there. And that individual did not know the form existed. They had no idea. And so contact us. We cannot personally advocate for every single person, but we can point you to the right things to ask for and point you to the right places to go. Try to contact recipient rights. And I think some of the best advice I can give, even though it's almost impossible to follow, and I recognize that, is do your best to stay level as that goes on. Because the last thing we want are excuses to keep the person longer, because obviously it's a very agitating and frustrating and scary situation.
May I ask a question, Simon?
Yeah, of course.
I just want to confirm that recipient rights stand whether you're a patient in the emergency room or a patient at a mental health hospital, correct?
So that is a little complicated because under the mental health code, the places that are supposed to have an office of recipient rights are the licensed psychiatric hospitals, and the state psychiatric hospitals. But almost every single emergency room, physical health hospital has either recipient rights, or sometimes it's called patient rights, or sometimes it's called a patient advocate. If you ask for any of those things, they should be able to direct you to the right person.
At Providence, I did ask for that person, and I was told that they weren't available to come to where I was, to that ward. And then I asked for a lawyer, and they laughed at me. So I just wanted to confirm there's some sort of assistance at either place.
I will say that some of the calls that I got when I was explaining to folks about the form and in the 3-day rule, when I tried to reach recipient rights officers at 2 hospitals, it was extremely difficult to track down. I actually I had to reach out to the state recipient rights office and ask who is the rights officer for this hospital, because that was the only way to get the accurate information. Even the switchboard at a particular hospital couldn't direct me to the right place. Now, when you're in the psych unit, there should be posters that say know your rights, and Disability Rights Michigan's number is supposed to be on there. They have a toll-free number, so it should be posted on the unit.
When it comes to the intake places, whether it's an ER or another form of intake, there's a few places in our community that does this. What can be done at that level to make sure these questions are getting answered? Or like Bri was saying, she was asking these, she was talking to everybody she could, but by her account, at that emergency room to try to say, like, listen, this is getting out of control here. So what can you do as either a family member or as the patient before you get transferred to the psychiatric hospital to make sure that it doesn't unnecessarily escalate into an involuntary stay?
I don't know how to answer that question except to say that I think one of the issues is that, and this is not on the patient or the family's end, I think there needs to be more education of people who work in the emergency rooms, particularly social workers, about the way the process is supposed to work and who should be made available to people who seek treatment about what their rights are. I think that may be one of the missing components, is that those who work in the emergency rooms don't always know what the law says or how it's supposed to go. I mean, I would hate to have to say anybody who has a psychiatric, if you have a psychiatric diagnosis and you might need to go inpatient, you might need to really educate yourself on the law. But I think that may be partially what is required here, for you to know as much as you can as well, about what are your rights and what can be done. And to Simon's point, as frustrating as it is and very aggravating, to the extent that you can not act out of that, that would be beneficial too, because it could add to your problem.
Can I speak on that a little bit also? There was a short time when I was at Providence that I did have access to my phone. And I looked up the Michigan recipient rights laws and I tried to present them to the people who were holding me, and they completely ignored it. I asked them, I said, do you want to see this? Do you want to see these laws? And they said, no, we don't. We're just going to do what we want to do.
And Heather, this is one of the most frustrating answers for me to give, because I'm not sure there is much a patient in that situation can do because the timelines are so fast. And not for the patient. I understand like a day, 2 days, 3 days is not fast when you're being held in that way. But for something like the legal process or a rights investigator, that's a short process. So the best advice I can give, and we're going to talk about this more at the end and provide some resources, is make the appropriate licensing complaints and requests for investigation after the fact so we can end this. And like Marianne was saying, also educate the emergency rooms on what the patient rights actually are.
I'd like to ask a question that came in from our viewers, and I believe Bri had an issue with this as well, which is, as a patient, are you allowed to keep your phone?
I had my phone the first night I was there, and then the next day they told me that they were going to search my things and take my things, and I did have my phone at the time. I told them that you can't do that according to this law. I told them there's the constitutional right against search and seizure, and they said that the hospital's policy trumps both of those things. So they did take my phone, and when I went to Pontiac General, I was also not allowed to have my phone.
So under the Michigan Mental Health Code, psychiatric hospitals are allowed to set rules on personal property and what you are allowed to have on the unit and what you're not allowed to have. So they can not allow you to have your phone on the unit, but they have to allow you reasonable access to a phone. They cannot completely restrict your access to using a phone. Of course, in this day and age, when you might not have all of your numbers memorized and things like that, that can be more or less useful. But when they take your possessions or have you give up your possessions, they have to give you a receipt for everything that you gave up. And of course, they have to give it all back when you leave. And Bri, you're shaking your head. I'm guessing you didn't get a receipt for the items you gave up.
No, I didn't. But to my knowledge, I did get it all back.
Yeah, so this is all really important information for people to know and to have, because, I mean, when you look at it this way, if somebody's having a real crisis, the focus isn't necessarily going to be on their own rights, right? They might be thinking about getting treatment, but then what happens when the treatment doesn't go in the direction that it probably should? That's when the problems arise. And if you're not familiar with the system, and I know this, you know, if you don't know how it works, it can be very overwhelming and very daunting for people. So is there anything else that you can point out, Simon, that should have happened in Bri's situation but didn't happen?
There's a lot. We've talked about most of it already. She should have had a valid psychiatric visit and diagnosis that was more than just 5 minutes. Signing in voluntarily should have been truly voluntary. She should have been informed of the intent to terminate treatment form and given the opportunity to access it. Um, so those are really some things that stick out to me in Bri's case that we hadn't hit on yet.
If she had said, no, I'm not going to sign in voluntarily, what would have happened next?
At that point, the hospital really has two options. If they believe she meets the definition of a person requiring treatment, they can file a petition with the court, which requires 2 certifications from mental health professionals, asking the court to order her involuntarily treated. They have to do that within a very short period of time, within a few days. The other option is to let her go. The standard for a person requiring treatment is really high. There are 3 options. The first is danger to themselves or others as a result of their mental illness. The second is unable to keep up their basic physical needs like food, clothing, shelter. And the third is that their mental illness is in such a state that they cannot understand their need for treatment. It's pretty hard to say somebody doesn't understand their need for treatment when they sought the treatment themselves.
Yeah, and just reading my medical records, like what you just said, triggered something. When the being able to take care of yourself and the upkeep. Like I said, when I was there, I knew like I had to present my best self, so that's what I did. And it was a complete surprise and shock to find in my medical records that they had said the opposite. They said I was disheveled. I hadn't been showering, just all sorts of things that were untrue. And, that triggers in my mind why they probably said that.
That very well could be, because on the petitions for the court forms for involuntary treatment, there are 3 boxes. That's the second one. And so, yeah, they could have tried to petition the court and gone through that, or they could have said, okay, we don't think you meet that standard, so if you don't want to be here, we'll let you go.
So, Simon, can you speak a little bit to the people that find themselves in the emergency room involuntarily? They've been brought in by a peace officer who witnessed behavior that they believe is a result of mental illness, or they brought in on a court order that somebody got through the probate court. What should be happening when those folks arrive in the emergency room?
Those folks arrive at the emergency room. They should be evaluated by a psychiatrist as soon as possible. I would have to double check the statute for the timeline, but I believe the longest they're allowed to keep you before doing a psychiatric evaluation is 24 hours. So within 24 hours, that person should see a psychiatrist, and then that is when that psychiatrist will make a determination, okay, maybe this person is suitable for voluntary treatment, or maybe they're not and we need to petition. And from there, there's another certification, there are the court filings, but that's what should happen when the person's brought in.
Heather's story talked a lot about clinical certificates, which are a very important part of this process. And there's 2 clinical certificates that are required. Can you talk a little bit about those 2 different clinical certificates and who can complete them? Because I think that's important for people to know.
Yes. So the first one can be a psychiatrist. It can also be a psychologist, or a certified mental health professional. And that initial certification is just that first, within that 24-hour finding, this person's been presented to this healthcare facility. Okay, we believe they need treatment and we believe they need to stay here. and then they can file the petition with the court with just that one certificate, or they can file it with two, and the second one needs to be from a psychiatrist if the first one is not. One of the two needs to be a psychiatrist. If the petition is filed with only one certificate, the court will order an examination for the second one. And the only way that doesn't happen is if they're completely unable to examine the patient for some reason.
Okay. So that's really important, I think, for folks to understand is that, and I'm confident that the statute says 24 hours. The person has to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. That's important to know because that means that only the psychiatrist can complete that second certificate.
And
the psychiatrist has to do it themselves, according to people we've interviewed, because that was an issue investigation of forms that were pre-signed and alleged to be filled out by other people. So that is a very key point to make. If that psychiatrist is signing it, according to the people I've interviewed, the Michigan Psychiatric Society, that person needs to be filling it out.
I agree. And the reason those are so important is because if they're petitioning you to be an involuntary patient and going through the court process, a probate judge is not a psychiatrist. So those certificates, that evaluation by the psychiatrist, by the other qualified mental health professional, the judge is going to heavily rely on those, or the jury if it gets to that point. So it's really important that those are done by the right people and it is an actual evaluation.
One of our viewers asked a really good question about that, and which is along these lines. And the question was, who is responsible for reviewing the validity of clinical certificates?
Oh, Heather, I am unaware of anywhere that is responsible for reviewing the validity. That's probably why two are required, so that if one's not valid or there are questions about one, can see if the two match up. That's probably also why if you are petitioned for involuntary treatment, you have the right to an independent medical exam. So that would be really important. But as far as I'm aware, there's no check to say, is this a completely valid certificate?
I agree with Simon. I don't think there's any way to determine that. At what point, Simon, so let's say somebody goes through this whole process, at what point is the person to be offered legal assistance, and when would a court hearing take place?
That's a really good question. Legal assistance does not come into play unless someone is petitioned involuntarily. So you can have that first clinical certificate and not have an attorney, but once they filed a petition with the court to start that process, you are entitled to an attorney and copies of those court filings as well, and notice that that's happening. And the timelines for getting in front of the court are short as far as court timelines. I believe it's 7 days. Within 7 days that a hearing needs to be held.
Okay. And so go ahead, Heather.
I was just to follow up on that, Marianne. If you signed in voluntarily, probably as formal voluntary, right? This has come up on a couple stories. If you as the patient are saying, wait, I signed in voluntarily, I want to leave and I'm not being allowed to leave, and you start asking for an attorney, what should happen then?
And this is why those intent to terminate treatment forms that people don't know about and hospitals aren't telling people about are so important. Because a good rule of thumb is if you sign a paper agreeing to treatment, you'll need to sign a paper to get out. So you'll need to ask for that intent to terminate treatment form. Once you sign and turn that in, that starts that 72-hour clock for the hospital to either let you go or file with the court. And then if they decide to file with the court, that's when you'll get an attorney and access to those rights.
So really, unless they start the legal process on the involuntary side, you really don't have an option for accessing an attorney.
Of course, you can always call out and work to retain your own, but as far as a right to a court-appointed attorney and a right to counsel, that's correct.
I think that's helpful for people to know, really. You know, Simon, you've given a lot of really good advice. Can you explain to people who Disability Rights Michigan is and what you do? Because I don't know that they know what you do.
Marianne, you should know I always have my spiel ready. So Disability Rights Michigan is federally funded, but we are independent of the federal government. We are not a part of state government, and we are designated by the governor to investigate and advocate on behalf of disabled people throughout the whole state of Michigan. We have an office in Marquette and an office in Lansing. We have several different teams that cover a wide variety of disability-related issues, like physical disability, accessibility to buildings. We have a voting rights team. So if you're disabled and want to enforce your right to vote, we have a special education team that works on school-related education issues and transition for disabled students to life after high school. We've got an employment team that works on employment-related issues. We've got a team that investigates representative payees for Social Security. We've got my team that does abuse and neglect investigations and also access to community services and help with that. And all of that is kind of bolstered by our awesome legal team who, if we can't solve it through advocacy, we sometimes have the capacity and the option to take things to the courts.
Thank you for sharing that.
Marianne, I forgot two very important things. One, your conversations with us are always confidential until you tell us you don't want them to be anymore. And two, our services are always free. And that's regardless of your income level, anything like that.
Thank you for sharing that information. Is there anything else? I'm looking at the time. Heather, anything else that we have not talked about that you think we should?
I'm going to throw a couple other viewer questions at the two of you experts on this. And if you can answer them in the time we have left, that's great. One is, can you refuse medication? I guess specifically for voluntary, right? I think involuntary, maybe you can't. And then also someone else asked, how are patients assigned to hospitals? Because that's come up several times.
Simon, why don't you tackle the medication question?
For sure. If you are voluntary, you can refuse medication. End of story. If you're involuntary, you can refuse medication until you are under a court order. That is, unless it's determined that you're a danger to yourself or others. But otherwise, you can refuse that medication.
Thank you. So how do psychiatric hospitals get chosen? Well, first and foremost, one of the things I do want to say is that there is a shortage of inpatient psychiatric beds in this state. So that's been an ongoing issue, especially on the child and adolescent side of the equation. But the way that you might find yourself in a particular psychiatric hospital has a lot to do with bed availability. but also has a lot to do with your funding stream. So for example, if you have Medicaid or you have no insurance, your hospital stay will be paid for through community mental health, through one of the 10 prepaid inpatient health plans in the state. So those are managed care organizations, and underneath them, 7 of them are multi-county. And so in our state, we have 83 counties, we have 46 community mental health services providers. So for anybody with Medicaid, and even for people, if you have a Medicaid health plan, we have what's called the behavioral health carve-out in Michigan. So the Medicaid health plans do not pay for any inpatient psychiatric care for people with Medicaid. Only though the community mental health service providers or the PIHPs, prepaid inpatient health plans, pay for inpatient psychiatric treatment. That's true if you have TANF Medicaid, if you have Healthy Michigan Medicaid, if you're a person with a disability, aged or blind, it's all covered through the public mental health system. That is completely where you would go for treatment is dependent upon what hospitals the community mental health service provider contracts with. So, you know, some CMHs don't contract with every psychiatric hospital or unit in the state. The other bigger issue, which is why I talked about bed availability, is a lot of times people are sort of stuck in the position of having to wait for a bed. In that case, if there are no beds in Michigan, then because of what's called an interstate compact, you could find yourself going to Indiana or Wisconsin or Ohio for mental health treatment. And we do have what's called an interstate compact with those states, or another state is Wisconsin. So you don't have a lot of choice sometimes about where you're going to get inpatient psychiatric treatment for all of the above reasons. On the private health insurance side, a lot of it is who your insurer contracts with, who's considered in network, out of network. And again, the bigger overarching issue is bed availability. Are there any more questions, Heather? Or I think we're just about out of time, aren't we?
There are more, but we are definitely out of time. So we'll have to maybe revisit this issue down the road, because it does seem like people have a lot of interest in it.
Well, in closing, I really want to thank Bri and Heather and Simon and WXYZ-TV for giving MHAM the opportunity to be the host of this particular community conversation about, you know, inpatient psychiatric hospitalization and the whole process, the way it's supposed to go. We appreciate the audience participation. We realize that there is a lot to this issue, and what we're seeing is that a lot of emergency room visits are mental health related. And again, to kind of talk about what I said earlier, we don't want to dissuade anybody from seeking emergency mental health treatment if you need it. One thing I do want to say is that typically an emergency room at a hospital will not provide or will not prescribe psychiatric medication when a person goes in. That's why we're now seeing a couple of things on the policy side that are positive. One is crisis stabilization units, but also we're seeing basically the equivalent of a psychiatric emergency room. I know Pine Rest out in Grand Rapids has a psychiatric urgent care where people can go if they're in a crisis, and they can actually get medication prescribed to them at that time. So we're seeing things move, but we're seeing them move really, really slowly. In closing too, I also want to remember to mention again the 988 crisis line. If any of this has been triggering for you, I know that this is a difficult topic to talk about. You know, please, if you have any questions, you have contact information for all of us. And again, thank you for joining us. And I hope that this was helpful for everybody.
We do have contact information on our website, and a lot of the other resources that have been mentioned. They're all at WXYZ.com.
Yes. And thank you. Have a good night, everybody. And thanks, Bri.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.